I became interested in this idea of what passes down through the generations. If you've had like 7 generations working the land, being in the landscape and being in this place, does any of that come down? Is any of that experience in the DNA? Or do you know what I mean? It's like, why do I feel like an affinity with this place? It feels like home. Those things kind of interest me. It's kind of, some people could think, well, that's madness, but is it that mad?
Well, welcome to the show, Rob.
Thanks for having me. Really lovely to be here.
All right. Just as we begin here, I'll just go ahead and allow you to introduce yourself to the audience and send it over to you.
Cool. That's great. So I'm Robert Darch, and I'm an artist photographer, and I'm based in the southwest of England. I grew up in the Midlands in England, and I suppose my photographic journey started in my teenage years. And then I went to university to study a BA in documentary photography. And then latterly, I went back to university in my 30s to do a couple of master's degrees in photography. And I'm an associate lecturer at Plymouth University. And I'm also part of the team at Falmouth University. And I lecture at a few other universities as a sort of visiting speaker lecturer as well, and do talks and books, exhibitions, and kind of everything, a smorgasbord of stuff, really.
That's awesome. So talk to me a little bit about photography is obviously a big part of your life, and it is very much in your work as an artist, and also what you do with teaching. Talk to me a little bit about who you were before you were a photographer.
Yeah, I guess as a teenager. So I suppose before, I've been taking pictures for quite a while. I got my first camera was maybe around 15 years old, like an old
so it's deep.
SLR. Yeah, deep. Yeah, so a long time. So I got the camera, and I was kind of hooked from there, really. And at that point, then, I had like a lot of friends, and I was skateboarding, so I had like a subject matter to take pictures of as well. And it's obviously like a very different time from how things are now with kind of phones and whether that on-screen phones and digital photography. It's kind of, the image is omnipresent, but back then, like, taking pictures wasn't a very cool thing to do. It was predominantly people who were taking pictures aside from the family snapshot or things for the family album were kind of middle to old age men that were photographing trains, butterflies, and sort of scantily dressed women in sort of soft focus. So it wasn't like a cool thing to be doing. And also skateboarding wasn't very cool as well,
Yeah. I remember this.
Yeah. So yeah, it was kind of the sort of, for me, I grew up using film. That was my way into taking pictures, and I don't know, it's kind of, really sort of interested me to begin with. I've always been a kind of creative person, but there was something that was quite immediate about photography, and that's kind of what drew me in a way, like painting and drawing. I was frustrated because I wanted to be really good, and it involved putting in all that time to kind of learn those skills, and was like, I can just take a picture. And that was quite appealing, really, as a teenager.
Was there anybody that was really influential on you early as a photographer?
Not really, no. And I think it's no. Again, it's I was kind of just out on my own. It was pre-internet, and now for like young people and students, internet, Instagram, there's just like a wealth of kind of visual stimulation. But for me back then, I hadn't even really been. I'm just quite lucky that my parents took us to exhibitions that were like painting and art and sculpture, but I don't remember going to a photography exhibition. And I didn't know anyone else that was a photographer, and I wasn't even really looking at any books, So I was kind of stood out above the motorway with my camera set up on a tripod, like shooting like light trails, thinking like, oh, this is amazing. I bet nobody's ever thought of this. It's like, wow, look at this. Lines and, I was like, whoa, I reinvented the wheel, So I had nothing, and then maybe, I guess, but this would have been a few years later when I was kind of like 18, 19, I kind of became aware of like photography and books. I think maybe like an early book I bought was like Ernst Haas. His work really appealed to me as kind of colourful and artistic and quite creative, sort of Austrian photographer back then, Magnum, and made a lot of work in America. But really, it was only when I latterly went to university when I was 21 to do my BA that I was introduced to kind of a world of photography, really. That was, my kind of understanding of what was good, what was not good, who was making work, different types of works. That was the beginning of that, really.
So what part of photography kept you there? What were you doing? So if you didn't have an influence, an artistic influence, or you weren't really looking at much, what do you think you were doing? I think, for me, when I first started to use a camera, I was kind of exploring not only the tool but the world around me, it was almost therapeutic in a way. I was kind of figuring out what I was interested in and what I was looking at. What do you think you were doing, with those early days?
Yeah. I think it was kind of similar in a way. It was just a way to kind of, also as a person, I'm kind of more introvert than extrovert. Weirdly, sometimes I was quite extrovert, first on the dance floor, going crazy. But, the general setting was like more introverted, and photography was good. I could step back a little bit. I really loved just seeing what was going on. So that was something. But there's also I liked documenting. I loved recording, and that's maybe a slightly OCD thing that would be maybe in the family. And my dad's a big recorder of the weather and the rainfall, the amount of rain. So that's his thing, or writing diaries. So maybe there was something of that kind of recording, documenting. And I also kind of knew, weirdly, I was kind of old for my age. I had this sort of hindsight as it was happening. This is me, I'm young, this is a scene, we're skateboarding, I'm going to record this because this won't be forever.
Mm-hmm.
So there was definitely that going on. I think now as a kind of adult looking back, I just think, I wish I had some of the knowledge that I had now. I wish I had a medium format camera back then. I wish I knew more. I wish I was being more focused, my portraiture and what I was doing. But, it is what it is. But, it was a commitment back then. I was after college, I was working jobs, kind of reasonably lowly paid jobs. I was working in factories, and then the builder's yard for a couple of years, for a long time, and then skateboarding in the spare time and taking pictures. So it gave me some money to kind of take my, film, my 35mm film into a local lab back then, just high streets like Boots or Smiths. You could easily just get everything processed there, and it's £4 and you pick up your pictures and you'd look at them, and my mates would, call me the paparazzi as a kind of joke because I was always taking pictures.
Were you hiding in the bushes?
I'm not quite that bad. I'm always contemplating, that one, Back then, at the time, it was really annoying for them, but now it's just
they probably love it.
Pictures, yeah, I love it. I mean, it's I was that pictures and also video, so I was making skate videos as well, so filming and taking stills.
That was a whole genre. That whole skate video, and I remember some of the first skate videos were in HD, skater videos and stuff. I remember a lot of music was influenced by that. A lot of music and skating. It was a big thing. Sorry. Go ahead. No.
I was going to say, I think you're maybe a bit younger than me because the skate videos when I were all analog, so it was kind of high 8 or pre-high 8 or
there you go.
We're pretty, but yeah.
Well, I guess I guess it might have been. I guess that was 80s, skater, and then you had the 90s.
Yeah,
I'm talking 90s. It got really big. There was
yeah,
movies and stuff like that, and it was something that inspired me to get into photography. It was always something that I loved music videos, and so that's really, really interesting. How influential was education on you in developing your work?
I mean, it really was when I went to do the degree. I mean, when I was at college, I did it's like a minor qualification over here. It's called like a city and guild. So it's more like a vocational qualification. That was in my second year of college, and it gave me access to the dark room, which is amazing to have that, to start developing your own stuff, making your own prints. I never ever processed my film, so I was always terrified I'd mess it up, and I'd lose the images. So I always got kind of the one of the far more conscientious girls to kind of develop my films for me, and then I'd make the prints in the dark room. And I love that. I spent a lot of time. I can remember my geography teacher kind of having a go at me because I was always late for lessons, and she's kind of like, well, photography's not a thing. Why are you putting all your time and energy into that? I was just like, well, that's what I enjoy doing. So it was kind of minimal there. The guy teaching it was, really kind of old school. Take a picture of a balloon seller in the street and kind of hand color the balloons different colors. So it was pretty cheesy stuff. So there wasn't an influence there. So it was really the BA was a big change. And I think in terms of how education, I've seen how education has changed in terms of photography. And back then there were very few BA courses in, the UK, because it seemed to be less of a thing, and the people that it attracted, and especially I was lucky enough to get into Newport, which have a really good reputation for the documentary course. So I was 21, so I was maybe 3 years older than most normal students that go to university from college, but I was probably one of the younger students. There are people in their kind of mid-20s, people in their early 30s that were maybe either already working as photographers, that kind of sort of won awards, in their kind of respective countries for their photography. So it was quite a serious kind of time, that were people have gone to well-known photographers there at the same time at Newport as me. So that was really good. And then obviously the lecturers, so it was kind of Ken Grant, Paul Seawright and Clive Landon, a really good level of, they had a great practice. They talked about their work, what they were doing, their exhibitions and the books. So yeah, and they introduced us to kind of everyone, for me, as always a kind of virgin, it was well, this is everything, kind of all the American photography. And that's what I was drawn to, a lot of the color Americans, so Joel Sternfeld, Stephen Shaw, Joel Merovitz, those photographers. And then over in England, it would be Paul Graham and Jem Southern, but it tended to be that sort of latterly, that sort of large format color photography, quite images. That was what I was kind of interested in, and less so kind of traditional black and white photography, not so much at that point. But it kind of opened me up to the possibilities and a kind of history of photography, really. And I was just super eager, I was just lapping it all up. It was amazing. I always get frustrated with students these days if they're just kind of not into it or not. And I'm like, seriously, what's going on here? Why are you not embracing it?
Did you just see that? Come on. Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm curious. When did you, when you're in you just referenced some students, they may or may not be attaching themselves to this idea of being a photographer. When did you make that choice that you're like, this is what I want to do and I'm going to do it no matter what? When did you finally do that?
Yeah, I think before I made the decision to go to university, it was well, this is what I want to do. This is it. I want to be a photographer. I didn't really know what that meant at the time. I probably had stupid ideas that I wanted to be a kind of sort of romantic notions of being a war photographer at the time, because that's, reportage, that kind of thing, but, in hindsight now, that's just, young man's folly. So that moved away quite quickly. And then I kind of really just started making work that was much slower and sort of much quieter. And I suppose kind of more artistic, moving away from this kind of quite straight documentary image to something that was kind of more creative, something more artistic, something more poetic. And that interested me more, I think, than this kind of outdated idea of kind of black and white 35mm truth, truthful pictures of a photographer, the kind of, yeah.
Looking at your images, I see a lot of care, and I see a lot of attention that you play. You're kind of playing with this dynamic between your relationship with space. And I was kind of curious how much research goes into your work. Do you spend a lot of time in research, or is it kind of organic? Do you know what you're shooting when you're shooting it, or are you kind of like intuitive about it?
It all depends on the project, really, but more on the kind of at the beginning, I don't necessarily know what I'm doing, but then through the process of taking pictures, you realize what the work is, or you have like more of an understanding about it, or you find a way into the work. So it could be, am I interested in a place? That could be the starting point. And then I start making pictures in that place, and then I start, well, what am I doing? I'm having an awareness about what's been done there before, like the history of the place, the history of photography. But then it's really kind of sort of latterly, everything since I went back to university to do the masters, it's really the work is all quite personal. So there's normally like a personal angle, maybe linked to kind of family history or my own life experience, and then I kind of bring that into the work. But I quite often talk about it in talks about, for some projects, the idea of like a jigsaw puzzle. Like I end up with lots of different pieces, just trying to find the way that they all fit together to become something. So it tends to be quite organic. And then maybe some of the projects, there's a bit more research that goes into it, like the kind of family history, researching a little bit into that, but it's still kind of light compared to some people that are research-based photographers. I tend to make quite like a simplistic distinction between head and heart. So like I'm like a heart photographer, and it's about emotion, and I want to show emotion in the pictures, as opposed to a head photographer that might make these quite clinical pictures, have this quite like complex idea or reasoning behind the work, so you kind of need to read like 10 pages to kind of understand what's going on. And that's just a different way of working, and it's just not my way of working. So I tend to be drawn to photography and pictures that are by other kind of heart photographers that have some kind of emotion or feeling in them, because that's what I like doing. So that's what I like looking at as well. So yeah, the simple answer is not huge, but if we're talking about like research in the wider sense, not kind of reading books and doing research online, but there's a research in being out in the world and exploring a place. So that's predominantly where a lot of the research is, and finding out about places and locations and going out and exploring. So that's where the research element comes in more for me, I would say.
So that's an interesting. You made 2 points there that I really like, and the first one is the difference between head and heart, and I love that distinction, and maybe we'll come back to that. But you were talking about research, but the research as exploring the place. What do you mean by that?
What did you say? Sorry, I didn't catch that.
You were talking about like research as in like this exploring of a place, or exploring it with it as a photographer. What do you mean by that? Like,
so it's you're spending time in a place that you get to understand the place, the kind of the geography, the landscape, the people, the light, in a specific location where the sun sets or where the light falls at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day. I think it's that thing that it sets something aside from being like a tourist, like just going somewhere, taking the picturesque landscape, like work that's made in, people, just as a generalization, they go to Iceland, it's kind of like inherently picturesque. You could literally sort of go like this, close your eyes and get something, because you have mountains, horizon, whatever, all this stuff going on. Whereas I much prefer to seek out, to find images, make sense of what I'm looking at in a woodland or like a kind of a more kind of gentle, subtle landscape, and kind of draw some kind of frame something from that, really, but really with an understanding of the place and the light. You might know the quote. It's the Robert Adams quote, isn't it, about autobiography, geography, and metaphor, isn't it? Those three things make a good picture. So I think that all of mine tend to have that. There tends to be lots of metaphor in the work, an understanding of geography and the autobiography, the personal, the me. So that's it. It's being in places, and not always taking pictures, just walking, looking, standing. I mean, that's like, so I'm experiencing it as well as taking the picture. Does that make sense?
Light on, yeah. Oh, absolutely. You were talking about the light of a place, and that there is a big difference, and there's a lot of people that actually comment that the light's a little different in like different geological locations than it is. They're comparing those two things, but as a photographer, that's what we do, is we capture light in a box, and so light on landscape is something that is very, very apparent in your work. And I notice your attention to it, especially in the landscapes. And so I felt like that's a really interesting comment. But the other part that I've been thinking about this idea, this show is inspired by understanding images and kind of delving deeper into imagery. And you said something that might be a little piece of the puzzle here, and I kind of want to understand it. I came back to this idea of a truthful image. Like it's you're supposed to be. Let's say you are a documentary, or you're doing something for the news or something like that, and you're trying to take an image of this place, but in a lot of ways, you're already kind of limiting an image based off of, the square in the camera. You're not seeing everything. You're really just seeing what the machine's pointed at. But I've been kind of working with this idea that an image is a thinking device, right? And it gets you thinking about an idea. And the only truthful thing is the way it makes you feel. And I'm kind of curious, as a heart photographer, as you like to say, like it comes from this place, kind of like an internal. What do you think about that idea? Shouldn't necessarily trust an image as true, but maybe the more true thing is the feeling. What do you think about that? I'm curious. It's an idea I'm playing with right now. As mental table tennis. This is what this is right now. Yeah.
So if like an image does affect you, like emotionally,
of course,
so there's going to be some truth and there's some kind of feeling in that. But in terms of this kind of idea, this notion of kind of like documentary as being truth and as being objective, it's completely immaterial. There was never the case. It was subjective to who was taking the pictures, how they were taking them, what their political views were, maybe if that was relevant, and how it was framed, what they were doing. Even kind of like people that were working in that vein, we kind of know in hindsight some images were slightly staged and things were moved around. So, there's no notion of truth. I mean, even like the new topographics who, that work I like, it's still not topographical. It's still not like this objective. They're still making all these very specific decisions, like Lewis Bowles is like shooting in black and white and shooting in this type of camera and deciding to focus on like, parking lots and industrial complexes. So it's all kind of like subjectively led by what interests them or what they want to say or what they'll kind of make of something. So, you know, the kind of the gist or the kind of motivation of the photographer or the artist is kind of integral in terms of what image means. You know, everything's subjective, and I think like I move between different spaces of work that I would classify as more documentary in terms of, you know, I'm photographing a group of people that are working and doing something. They're in a place, you know, so that's kind of more documentary. I'm not positioning them or orchestrating them. They're there and I'm coming along and just capturing it. But I'm still making lots of decisions of how to frame that and what to do, what to include and not include, as opposed to a project, you know, that's more like I'm deciding who to go and photograph with, and we're going to specific places, and I'm picking the day and the weather so there's still like a contrast in between that. But there is no truth. It's just somebody's viewpoint, you know, somebody's kind of, you know, what they want to kind of say about the world, really.
I think that's interesting. So I think this is a great time to flip over to some of the images that you wanted to share. And so we can go ahead and flip over and you've prepared a few images that kind of take us through kind of chronologically of your development as a photographer. And so I think this is a great opportunity we've been talking about you. And so I think this is a good opportunity to kind of see what you're doing. And so we'll go ahead and flip it over.
Good, yeah. So you can see the first image. So I thought it'd be really helpful to go through work as you said, chronologically. So you can kind of almost see a development of where I've come from. So the first image I picked was an image I took of my friend Dad. We'd been skateboarding like an underpass, like under the motorway in the town that I grew up in, and a lot of this old work, and I've been scanning in some black and white work that I did at Newport and thinking like, I have no memory of taking these pictures. Like literally no memory. I have the images, but I have no memory of the process of taking them. So the same with this. So I would imagine, because I wasn't staging or orchestrating anything then, that he was just taking a break. I saw this, the light kind of end of the day coming in, and it was the kind of first time for me that I realized that it wasn't just like the skateboarding pictures that I was interested in. It was actually much more those quiet moments. So like the spaces in between. So when people were taking a break or resting or doing something else, or kind of like lost a bit in their own space. So I think for me, this was like a really important image. Possibly, you know, maybe at the time, but also like in hindsight now, I can look back at that and realize that's what I was doing. That's what I was thinking about at that time to take that kind of image, because it was different to these kind of action photos I was taking. So yeah, I thought it was important to have that as the first one. I think it was the first time I really had that feeling, like you said, when did you know? It's like, yeah, there's something about this that really interests me. Do you want me to move on to the next image?
Of course, but you can actually see something. Remember how I was telling you that you're paying attention to lights, and something that I've noticed, it's even back here. It's even back early on in your photography journey. You see it in this image. It's cool.
Yeah.
It reminds me of my childhood. Actually. I was a skater too, just like that. I used to sit on my skateboard just like that. So it's very reminiscent.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's good. Well, it resonates. Do you know what I mean? That's the important thing about photography, that if you can do something that resonates with someone else, you know, and I've had that latterly, that work that's resonated with someone on the other side of the world. Do you know what I mean? And they've got the same thing that I had. So that I find that really interesting. So the second image, this is me now, documentary photography at Newport, and we started off really simply. The first term has always been the same. At Newport's now moved to Cardiff. I don't know if it's still the same, but you'd work with the building blocks of documentary photography. So you'd start off with like an establishing shot, maybe a person at work, portrait, a detail, and a relationship image. And then once you'd gone through them, we moved on to kind of picture stories, so kind of like classic picture post Eugene Smith, bringing together those images to tell a story. And my dad knew this kind of retired captain that was now like an exorcist. So that sounded really interesting to me because I'd always been interested in like supernatural things, UFOs, ghosts, that kind of stuff. So I went along and spent a day. An exorcist, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, totally. But I only spent a day with this guy taking pictures, and he was like a healer as well, and he did lots of things. I mean, interestingly, he did something where he kind of looked at my health, and you know, he felt like I wasn't very well, or I wasn't very good, and weirdly, like later that year, I became really unwell with like a illness, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But for me, in terms of image making, it was not taking like the obvious image, you know. It was just went across the road, and I just looked down and I saw this like shadow, and he had like this stick which he kind of used he said he uses the stick to kind of help spirits pass on to the other side. But I love the idea of this just line of the stick into the shadow, and him, this like the other world in a way, like the ghost, like this kind of these two worlds, you know. So it was the first time that I really started thinking in that way in terms of, you know, how I'm kind of constructing an image.
I love the contrast. It seems like the contrast has stayed with you. The high contrast image, it's beautiful.
Yeah. It's high contrast. I think at that time I found like the Fuji Neopan 1600, and I loved shooting on that as a film. So it was a real kind of fast film for the time, but real blacks and kind of high contrast. So I quite like that. But this is also an old scan, so I do need to rescan these. And so with that in mind, slight apologies for the next image, because these were scanned, you know, back when I made the work. So this is still at Newport. So the Exorcist image was made in the first year. So this is into the second year now, and I'd quickly moved into kind of medium format, color, the end of the first year, I think. And I suppose this was the first time that I started thinking about bringing two images together to create like a diptych, images working alongside one another. And the project that we had to do was the module was like a strategy. So we had to pick a strategy for a project. So my strategy was the diptychs, but it was also kind of like an abstract idea about waiting. So I'd find people at bus stops as a kind of like a literal waiting, but also trying to speak a bit more kind of poetically about the idea of waiting. So I think it was the first time that I kind of brought two images together and really enjoyed working in color. I think that there was, from my point of view, at that stage, I saw black and white as kind of more simplistic. And I can remember a lecture that Paul Seawright gave about some of Paul Graham's work in Northern Ireland, and talking about how he used colour and how he brought it together really subtly, and how that was quite a hard thing to do. And I was just like, right, that's hard. Okay, so that's what, in a kind of douchey way, that's what I want to do. That feels like that's the aim, you know. And I guess as a person, I've always been quite a competitive person, so it's like I want to do the best that I can. So yeah, it was the first time that I started bringing together images to create something else rather than just as two single images together. And so then there's a big break. So at the end of my first year, so just before the second year, I became unwell. I had like a minor stroke. So I ended up in hospital. Then I had a diagnosis of glandular fever, which the Americans call mono. And then I didn't feel right from that point on. I was quite unwell, and latterly I had a diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME. And now I guess in terms of like long COVID, that's really interesting in how some people have reacted to that virus. We've almost had this massive kind of not focus group, but like a group of people that we can see that there's been this definitive reaction to a virus. So I think for me, it was a combination of the minor stroke and the glandular fever. Something was misfiring in my body. So I managed to do my second year at university, but it was not easy. So I kind of struggled in terms of my health. Then I took a year out. I finished my final year back home in the Midlands. And then the following years were very difficult, so like maybe 8 or so years when I was kind of varying degrees of being unwell, more or less out of work. Towards the end, I was doing some volunteer work to get back into work. And my parents had retired south down to Devon. So I made the tough decision to move back in with them. And then thankfully I got better over a period of a couple of years, really, and made the move into a city in Devon, Exeter. And I got a job as a youth worker in youth service, and I got a job at the art centre, and I started volunteering at the art centre. So that was kind of a way into sort of restarting my life. And I was just into my 30s. So in a lot of ways, I was like a kind of graduate, but all the, everybody that was doing in a similar position to me was, like 8 or 9 years younger, so that they were kind of coming out of uni and then they were trying to find what they wanted to do, really. And I started doing lots of stuff in Exeter, kind of like sort of low-end commercial photography, like theatre photography, band, music, festival photography, lots of moving image, documentary video work for kind of arts organisations. So I was doing lots of different things. And I was also there was kind of quite a break when I was ill in terms of taking work, because it wasn't realistic. I was on benefits. I didn't have the money for film. It was still kind of, film was a thing. So then once I'd kind of become well, then I got digital cameras, and digital had improved. I got the Canon 5D Mark II, and I started taking pictures again for fun. So this is a picture I took of my girlfriend just in the woods, and she spotted like a group of deer. And it, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of the elements in my work now, kind of that sort of feeling of sort of like nostalgia or awe, or kind of that kind of relationship or kind of interaction with nature. And so I met my girlfriend, who's still my current partner, and she'd come over from Germany to do a master's in photography at Plymouth University. And interestingly enough, the course was being taught by Jem Southern. It'd always be one of my favourite photographers when I was at Newport, one of my favourite British photographers. I didn't know he was really based around there, and I found out I was literally living like 3 minutes away from him where I was. There was all these kind of things came together, and they both kind of taught me into sort of going back to university and sort of taking the photography more seriously. So I've got them both to thank, really, for kind of talking me into doing that. And obviously from my point of view, like psychologically, there was a lot of baggage, because I kind of almost felt as well my sort of drive and ambition and kind of perfectionism kind of played some part in me having that minor stroke and getting ill. So I had to really sort of manage expectations. And to be honest, it was completely changed. I mean, the experience changed me as a person. And I had some ambitions, but not in the same way that I did when I was kind of 21. So it was just a way to go back into doing that. And then, so the first project I worked on was the Moor at university. So there's a lot of information to take in there.
No, it's I've read about that, those moments in your life where those unforeseen breaks that you had to take. It's interesting. In that time, did you feel drawn to work? Did you feel drawn back to your camera? And
yeah, I mean, I just couldn't afford to buy film and do it. But I was always, I mean, what I'd almost say about like when I went to do the masters, and I worked on the Moor and Vale. It was like everything was there, like my way of working, my style. It was all there. Like I didn't need to work on it. So it's almost like in my head, I'd been working on all this stuff for years, thinking about images, thinking about things. Like it was there. And then obviously, like I had like course mates from Newport that were going off and doing things and winning awards and taking pictures. So it was frustrating that I could see them doing that, and I felt like I was just held back, and it wasn't all negative, but there were just really tough points where you're thinking like, oh, is this my life now? It's kind of, I'm nearly 30 and I don't have much of a life. So it almost kind of seems sort of unrealistic, or not unrealistic, but like, time, I guess, is a healer. Like now it's kind of like you forget a lot of that stuff, a lot of the negative stuff, but it wasn't easy. So
it was a pivot point for you. And I think that's interesting. It's, there's this theory that I read about, and they were talking about most things happen in the head before they actually become physical. So you dream about it and you see it first before it actually happens. And when you're kind of forced into a moment where you have to put the tool down and to kind of you're taking almost mental images and you're kind of working through those mentally, you were almost you were still working, but you weren't with a camera. And I'm kind of curious. One of the things that I've noticed, especially in the island, is you're telling a story with images really well, and you're using a symbolism that I see in the previous images, and you're almost kind of world building in some ways. Yeah. Do you think that time actually got you ready to world build with a camera? Do you see what I'm saying? I
agree. It was in a way, like you have to think it's quite like a drastic shift in terms of my way of working here, from documentary at Newport. And then obviously I was doing bits of commercial, which I enjoyed. The theatre photography I really enjoyed because it was like photographing like a film set for me. I was on stage and I loved that, like the narrative and things going on. All these things, films, TV, music, it's all crashing around in my head. But yeah, the world building is like, what am I doing? And I kind of moved into this, like, I really like working with people and landscape and kind of constructing something. And latterly we'll talk about Durlescombe. Like I might photograph one thing and I think, no, it doesn't fit into this place, because I have this the vision of it, the idea of it is something that exists in my head, how it is. Do you know what I mean? Even though it's fictional, there's stuff that fits in, the stuff that doesn't fit. So it's kind of like a start for this, but there was also like, the limitations of studying. It's kind of, the master's, it was part-time, so it's 2 years, but I always knew I wanted to make a work on Dartmoor because we visited as children, so it had this kind of lasting effect on me. And then by some kind of happenstance, I could end up living near it, and I could have worked traditionally, documentary images of people living there, but that all takes time to happen, to organize. So there was some practicality involved, but there was also, I liked the idea. And then we go to the notion of control. So for 10 years, I felt like there was no control over my life. So now I could control what I'm doing photographically. I can control the situation. So, I'm working with people I know or kind of know through other people for the more that I feel like fit into this fictional space. So that's the starting point, and I kind of had this idea for this image with Guy, a chap I worked with at the art centre. He was on the bar, but, a character, somebody that when I picked him up to photograph this, he was living on like a shed in Cornwall on the cliffs in a kind of commune. And, so he wildcaps on Dartmoor, sleeps in hedges, so he fits into this place I'm creating. So it was a big move, it was kind of, I'm constructing this. And at the time I was like, can I do this? Is this a thing? Is this, because it's not documentary, am I allowed to to do this. Do you know what I mean? And so I'm kind of questioning myself, like I'm an image maker that luckily I've always felt like I can make strong images. That's just something that inherently maybe I have within me. So I never doubt that. I always feel sorry for people that don't have the confidence in what they're doing. I always have the confidence in my ability to make an image, but it's the validity of what you're doing. Is this kind of valid? Is this acceptable? Because I couldn't really see anything in the wider photographic world that was in a similar vein, where you're kind of making something that could kind of be documentary, but it's not documentary. And, there's that kind of fine line between the two, which I really like as well. Like in terms of staging work, so this is staged, but I want it to feel like it's observed or documentary. I don't like looking at stage work. And I'll take that back. I do really like some of Gregory Cruzen's work because it's just amazingly cinematic, but it is staged. Do you mean you can tell by looking at it there's some staging going on there? Whereas I think what interests me more is this idea of like, is this staged? Is this documentary? Is this something in between? So that was a lot of the ideas that were kind of pinballing around my head at the time. So I made 2 projects during my master's degree. So that was the Moor and Vale. And so Vale was, again, like kind of staged, but a bit more documentary. So it was a bit looser, a bit of both. I'd orchestrate situations. I'd set up and I was running like a youth group, like a collective for young photographers in Exeter. I'd started that before I went back to do the masters. And it just kind of worked out. We'd go out and we'd take pictures on a Tuesday evening. We were very lucky near Exeter. There were lots of kind of beautiful places and landscapes. You had like the sea, the estuary, the valley, the woods. And, so I just naturally started photographing with the young people. And so then that led into Vale, which is very much one of those jigsaw puzzle projects. And I included this image because it's interesting, because if you look at it, you can kind of almost see like a figure in the window, which wasn't something I noticed when I was taking the picture. And it's almost like one of those kind of X-Files moments if Mulder had a camera and photographed the bloody UFOs, or you were kind of looking back at the pictures. I always imagine I've seen it in a horror film, and then you notice something in the photo, or maybe from The Ring or something like that, or Rigu. But I can notice a ghost. Yeah. And I'm like zooming in, and then it's like even more like a figure, and there's like a face, and it's just, I get that chill down my spine. And that kind of, I don't know, I found that really powerful. Like, inherently it's probably just a trick of the light, the way it's all falling. But, when I've shared this, people actually feel like it's staged, and there is somebody stood in the window that it's so believable as a figure. And because the work is dealing with those lost years, my ill health, it's that sort of ghost of the past. And I felt like when I was making this work, there was a lot of serendipitous things that were happening. And I guess, like, I'm not like a religious person, I don't believe in a God as such, but I kind of feel like maybe there's something. I feel like, for me anyway, this feels like there's moments in your life, there's this kind of like sort of fate moments, or you come across things, or, if I hadn't been ill, I wouldn't have made this work. I wouldn't have moved down to the Southwest. All these different things, all these decisions we make in our lives, sometimes we have control over them and other times we don't. They kind of dictate how our life is going to pan out. But, you make one or two seemingly small decisions, and then, you go in a different way. So all those things were kind of flowing around my head when I was making this work. And, there were other things that came across, like a bee swarm and like a foul log. I've never come across anything as weird or as creepy or as interesting, or there was something to me, like an energy about this that I was doing, and I was kind of almost like exercising something and kind of dealing with what happened to me. So that's kind of all summed up in this image, really.
And that's, it makes me think of that story you told about the exorcist and his premonition. of your illness. There is almost a faded quality to it, almost like it was getting you ready for something, a shift.
Yeah.
And
It's
that's
weird.
yeah.
And to be honest, inherently, I don't believe in like spiritualists or anything like that. I just think it's like a load of hooey. But I can't get over the fact I can't remember what he did. He did something like it was like stones or something like that. But it was like he was just like, yeah, you're not really well. Do you know what I mean? And I don't know whether that could have like been like a something like lodged into my brain, like a kind of whatever, or he could have picked up on something, who knows? But it's I don't have the answers, and nobody does,
Yeah. It's a story, and it's a pretty wild to think about, and I'm gonna listen when I hear these little these premonitions that come out of nowhere, I'd be like, what did you see? What did you hear? No, I'm just kidding. But that's fascinating. This image is it's really strong, and I love hearing what you have to say about it. And once again, I just see that playing with light, and you have this great depth in the image. It's beautiful.
Yeah, and to take away some of the mystery from the image, it was just Pete, who was in my collective at the time, and his girlfriend at the time, Jazz. I was just getting them to walk around this corner. That was it. Just as serious, like, I love this kind of framing of the house as I walk around there. So that was the kind of orchestration. But really, like, when I'm doing this kind of stuff, there's very little orchestration from me. Quite often, when I'm photographing with people like on the moor or Vale, we spend the whole day out walking and just chatting, and then there'll just be quiet moments and I'll just start taking pictures. And there's not this big kind of, not this huge direction from me. It could be like, I'll just maybe close your mouth, or it's all very, it's all quite subtle, which maybe helps feel kind of like, I don't know, maybe more realistic. So we had more in Vale, and I decided to stay on at uni. So I did an extra year. So I did an MFA. So I'm like a double master. And I could have did it at the time, again, like, practically speaking, it was quite cheap for me to do it, like ridiculously so now in hindsight. And did also, I'd done the 2 years, and I really felt like I had this kind of momentum. So it was really good to work with David Chandler at the time, who was running the MFA, kind of writer and curator. But I was really stuck for an idea, what am I going to do for the MFA? And it took a good 5 to 6 months to kind of come upon Durlescombe, what Durlescombe could be. And maybe I could talk a bit about that latterly when we look at more of the work. But I think, again, this was like another shift. So I've the more in Vale, kind of slightly more constructed. And then in a way, Durlescombe was like the first time that really I'd done proper documentary work for myself since back on my degree. And I was just like, there was a huge level of excitement for me. It was like, wow, amazing. So these guys here that were processing like wheat to make thatch for thatch roofs, and they're using a machine which is like over 100 years old. And I'd stumbled across this place previously when I was location scouting for the moor. And the foreman at the time was just like, oh, you can come in and photograph this. It looked really interesting, but my headspace was somewhere else. But I kind of remembered it when I was kind of formulating Durlescombe. So I went back. He remembered who I was a few years later and just like, yeah, that's fine. You come and take pictures. So it was amazing. So it was just there all day. And again, I was really lucky with the light coming in, streaming in like a kind of cathedral. But then for me, it's one of those images it's one of these, like almost a stage, like a kind of scene, like a painting or something happening that really interests me, that I'm stood there watching, and I'm kind of like putting myself in the right position, and I'm kind of waiting for this to happen. And what I also like is between the work, so Durlescombe is essentially predominantly just documentary images of people working in the landscape. I'm not really directing at all or constructing images. And I like how the images inherently kind of look the same as the images in Moore and Bale, so that kind of interests me. But yeah, it was that first time back to making documentary work, and there was a real, I don't know, like a kind of privilege to be there, and like a level of excitement, and this kind of carried on throughout Durlescombe, and then this image, which is maybe one of the more well-known images from that series, like the goose plucking. So it kind of came through making all those different connections and getting to know people, all that stuff that latterly would have taken time. So this was made after I'd finished the MFA, so I just carried the work on, and the chap John, who I'd met and I'd photographed with previously, told me about that he was going to do this. I just didn't know what to expect, but kind of when I walked into the shed, I was just like, yeah, this is unbelievable. And it's one of those moments, it's like an image maker as a photographer, you're just like, yeah, this scene is just something else. Like, wow, it's a privilege. And I get really excited. There's that level of kind of like, oh man, like I'm here, what a privilege. You know, you're kind of always looking around, is someone else going to photograph this? I don't know, like there's that. For me, I haven't really lost though, you know, kind of mid-40s. I've just, get really excited about. I don't know, like the privilege of being there, I've been able to photograph it is something else. So, so yeah, it's interesting how the way that I'm working has kind of shifted and kind of flowed, you know, and still does.
You can see the impact of documentary, even in your world building, and then how you're blending the two worlds together, and you really have a great eye for a scene, and being able to kind of compose it with the frame, so you can kind of get an idea of what is happening in a particular space and a place. And so these the last two especially, you get a real nice feel for that. And you're getting lucky with these lights, you know. I'm like, it's I love the contrast. They just pop right out, and the white is a great bounce, you know, a reflector there for you. It's like it's really interesting. Yeah. But if we're talking technique, you know, but like the subject is really
and I'm not really like a tech person, talk tech, because you know that's always like the lowest down my priority. But
yeah, I agree.
In a way, same. But in terms of this image, like the advantage of digital, which is how I work, shoot on like a Nikon D850 5.4 crop. So I treat it like using like a medium format camera with prime lenses. This big old light here was tungsten. So if you shot this on film, horrible orange muddy mess, you know, and there's no real way around that. With digital, play around with it, it'll just pull out that white balance, and you've got this white carpet of feathers, you know. So a lot of the work, in a way, I make, some of the work I made of like a walk on dartboard, 10 tools, I don't think I would be able to do it with film. So I really like working with digital, you know. It's great. It's kind of...
You go back and forth. You can see... do you think... having worked with early film cameras, it has affected the way you shoot digitally?
Yeah, I think learning on film was really helpful because you really understand how to use light. Okay. But what I would say is that digital is a different beast. You need to kind of, and you need to work with it in a way to try and give you the same result that film does. You know, there may be some like the older generation of photographers that made that move from film to digital. I can see in some of the images they're like taking pictures, but they're just expecting the digital to do the same as the film does. But it doesn't, because like the computer and the digital will want to make the whole scene equally bright. You know, but what you want is the focus you want is bright and light, and the rest is this kind of nice dark black look fading out. For me anyway, that's what I want. So
yeah, it's just beautiful contrast. Yeah,
it's just knowing how to use the equipment, and then there's luck. Do you know what I mean? This image, that there's the elements that come together. You got the place and the scene, fair enough, but then you got the old woman that just happens to be looking at me like a kind of look like I don't want you to be here. What are you doing? Like a kind of, and the old women were scary there, honestly. Like some of them were just like, enough, like, and one of the guys was like, oh yeah, the women, don't mess with the women. And then you got the woman next to her with the kind of the grey and white hair. She's kind of always sticking up, like she's kind of praying. So there's this kind of like, again, this spiritual sort of element that comes into to my work. So it's almost like this image contains more or less everything I do, in a way. It's kind of has all those elements. Yeah. So then we're into the island, which is the kind of, I suppose, the first work I made that didn't originate out of studying. So the impetus was the Brexit vote. That was, I suppose, the starting point. My girlfriend, my partner's German. And I guess I've always felt more European than English. That kind of came into it. And I've obviously always voted, but I've never really been that politically motivated, or I wouldn't really say my work is necessarily political, but I felt like this was a big thing. This was something different, and I kind of felt like a real heaviness about that decision. So yeah, I wanted to kind of respond to that, and that was the starting point. And then I've included this image. I mean, there's a lot of images in the project because I feel like, from my point of view, it's probably one of my favorite portraits. And in some ways, I can't explain why that is, but it's almost like there's something that, this idea of honesty, do you know what I mean? It just feels like to me, like a powerful kind of honest picture that feels, although again there's a level of kind of orchestration and that feels natural and genuine. It doesn't feel like a kind of posed picture. I don't know. So I think maybe that's why I've included this one from that series, and then I also included this image because predominantly my work post masters and including has been made in the Southwest, but for the island I felt like it was important that I went back to the Midlands. So a lot of the idea of the work also calls back to my kind of youth and kind of growing up in the mid-90s and how I felt then, and in terms of like what was available or the kind of mood or the atmosphere of the country. You can add New Labour just into power. You had like Brit art, Brit pop. England was this place that felt like anything was possible. I was skateboarding, partying, having fun. It was just, life was just like, obviously I was dealing with other life stuff, like heartbreak and, anxiety, like, a lot of people, but inherently it felt like, yeah, great. Whereas like for young people now, man, it seems much tougher. You had COVID. This was pre-COVID. I made this, but it could be a whack about COVID. COVID, Brexit, climate crisis, war. There's so much going on in the world politically at the moment. If I was a young person, social media, just everything, it just feels like it's a tough time to be a young person.
Well, and to your point on that, it's like the world's being piped in directly. It's like as a kid, yeah. I remember. I don't think we're too far in age, by the way.
Okay.
I grew up in the 90s. It was like, that was that time, and the news was on the newspaper with my dad at the table, and it was in the evening, yeah. And so I wasn't being like presented with bad news all the time. And so sure. You could escape with your friends into the woods and go skateboard, you know what I mean? And the world it wasn't that complicated back then. Or you just weren't aware of it. It was complicated. You just weren't as aware of it. And so it's, you're definitely right. There's definitely something different about this time than back then, for sure. So I think this is your final image, and then we can move on to another image, that other series that we had discussed earlier. But I have a question for you. You said something, and it keeps coming up, and I see it in some of your history, is you have the cross, the interaction with the Exorcist. You even when you were describing that one image of the goose pluckers, you saw that person kind of leaning back and you referenced prayer. Is spirituality, religion, is that an influence on you? Is it something that you're thinking about a lot? Is it something that's in conflict with you and in your images? How is that influencing you? I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, not really. As I said, I'm not religious. I was kind of brought up not religious at all, really, but by my parents. Neither of them kind of went to church or anything. So that's not been and it's not spirituality and it's not religion, but it's this kind of, it's the other. It's kind of like, it could be like Mother Earth. It could be like, is it Gaia? This kind of idea, this kind of ecosystem with the Earth, and it's kind of like everything's connected. That kind of interests me, and others. What is a life after death? Is there kind of some kind of I don't know, some kind of like consciousness, or I don't know. I mean, that all really interests me. People kind of believe whatever, or they have faith. There's lots of different faiths, but nobody really has any answers to this stuff. And that's like you need to read as much as you want, but you're never going to be able to give me the answers. And I don't know that. I think it's that idea of really not knowing. I think it's that kind of sense of trying to capture something that feels kind of slightly other or eerie that interests me. So it's not like religion or spirituality as such. It's just trying to make some kind of sense of what we're living through, really.
The mystical, Do you feel like you are? Do you feel like the world around you is mystical to a certain? Is there questions there for you? It seems almost the way you shoot is very dramatic. It's very mystical in a way. It's in that sense, and I just keep seeing it pop up. And I'm curious.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know. Like, always felt like when Trump got into power and we had Brexit, we had all that stuff going on. I just thought like maybe we're just living on the back of a turtle or whatever, or in the Matrix or something, because this is just so out there and insane. I just thought, what the hell is turtle? Like
heard that one.
We're in a game, we're in a kind of what like what is this?
This is some kind of simulation. Yeah.
I don't genuinely think that, but I think it's just normal, isn't it, to try and wonder or kind of make sense of what the whole thing is. Even like when I was a kid, when I was walking back from school, we'd come around, there's lots of bungalows. I just look up at the sky and I just think, oh my God, you're just on a rock in this space. I mean, how does that even work? I mean, I'm kind of boggled by stuff even we've invented, like how is it all working that we're talking here and you're beaming in from there? Like, I know it happens, but do you actually know how it, like, even like watching a TV with the tubes, it's like just things like that. I don't know, like, I'm this is where you stop me because I'm waffling. But yeah, it's just an interest in the world that we're living in, or like a fascination, even with like really kind of banal things. It's just like, well, what is that? And I think that's the thing that I would say to students. It's not really enough to just be interested in photography or taking pictures of your friends or the accident. That's just a thing. It's just like a tool. It's a medium. It's like, what are you interested in? What do you want to say? Have you got any passions, any hobbies? What do you want to photograph? So the photography is just kind of like a tool to do that in a way. And for me, so these projects is just me kind of like exploring or trying to understand, the world that I find myself in. Or, in the nation of something like Durlescombe, I grew up in the Midlands, but, going back like 3 or so generations, family history on my dad's side is all in Devon. Mum's side is in Cornwall, so it's very close to where I am now. The idea of like, we can say like if you have children, they're like their mum or they're like their dads. There's some similarities in terms of their personality or how they might act or some of their interests. You have these studies where twins are being separated and then they meet up like 30 years later and they're like the same person. So I became interested in this idea of what passes down through the generations. If you've had like 7 generations working the land, being in the landscape and being in this place, does any of that come down? Is any of that experience in the DNA? Or do you know what I mean? It's like, why do I feel like an affinity with this place? It feels like home. Those things kind of interest me. It's kind of, some people could think, well, that's madness, but is it that mad?
Interesting.
I don't know.
I think
I don't know.
To question our existence, to question, it's something we've been doing since I think as man became conscious, and so or humanity has become conscious, and so it's really interesting now. It's because you see a lot of the social institutions are not as powerful as they used to be, especially around religion and other things. But there's still this fundamental thing that we do as humans that is questioning the mystical. That it's seeing the patterns and this pattern making and with when there isn't a church to occupy that part of our humanity, in my opinion, what then becomes it, what goes in that place. I think it's interesting. I see you kind of doing that in some ways, and so it's fascinating. Which leads me into this series. It's an ongoing series called Durlescombe, and I would love to take a little closer look into that. You had mentioned that in the previous section a little bit about how this is kind of a documentary type thing, and earlier when I asked you that question about research and how you're kind of researching this place, I'm kind of curious. With that project, how much of that research was important, and could you kind of like talk about it and give us a little background on the project, a little bit, or look into it? Yeah.
So the original idea for Durlescombe started off kind of similar to some of the work I've been making previously. Do you want me to share a screen with the work, or?
Of course, yeah. Let's take a look at it.
So I'll maybe give you like a bit of background to the project. So and I'll click through the images. Maybe that's the best way to do it. So it kind of started off. I needed to do a project for my MFA. I didn't really know what to do, but I was interested in this area in Devon. There was between the two moors. You got Dartmoor in the south and Exmoor to the north. So I was just exploring, taking pictures, kind of finding my way around really. And I'd come up with quite like a convoluted, like fictional premise. I'd come up with a name quite quickly, Durlescombe. And my original idea was to maybe do something that was like black and white, kind of staged in the vein that I had been working on. So that was the original idea. And then I thought, well, people need to populate this place, Durlescombe. So I remembered the threshers that I'd been to previously, this place where we were doing this work. And I thought, well, that makes sense, because I was interested in this idea of like rurality. And so I went along and they weren't there, but I spoke to another guy and said, oh, they're out working on a farm. They'll be back another day. And so the place wasn't far from a town called Winkley. So I went there, and it was like a sort of drizzly sort of, probably would have been like late winter, early spring by now. And I was kind of walking around, and I knew from my dad was really interested in family history before I was born, and like a bit into when I was kind of like a young child. And this was before I became popular, and you had all the big TV shows and the ancestry websites. And so he'd researched our family history in the surname Darch, down to Devon. So I knew we had a history in this area and in this place. And I just thought for fun, I'd go into the churchyard and see if I could find like any Darches in gravestones and the churchyard. And then amazingly, like the gravestone just outside the front door of the church was like a Robert Darch. I was just like, oh, wow, because my name's always been reasonably unusual. I haven't met any of the Darches outside of the immediate family. And it was kind of one of those jigsaw puzzle moments. I was just like, okay, this is what Durlescombe is. This is like a way into this project. It's about this place that I'm interested in anyway. Why am I interested in it? I've got familial history here. It's a great way into making work in the landscape. And I found out that my ancestors ran grain mills. So they kind of process grain to grain like wheat in these kind of mills. And so this is like an original picture from the kind of around sort of like 1890, I would have said. And the guy lying down, the miller, is Richard Darch. So he'd be my 3 or 4 times great uncle. And so my 4 times great grandfather was also Robert Darch, and he owned a mill in a town in kind of mid North Devon. And the gravestone I found was his cousin, who was also called Robert Darch. So it was amazing for me. And this was all kind of information I'd found out from my father. So this was where the research started. He had like a big A4 folder with lots of information, like family tree and all that kind of stuff. So he traced the family back to, I'd say maybe like the 1620s. And then interestingly, latterly, my uncle, during all the COVID lockdowns, he went online and he found a link from our family back further. So the surname Darch is originally French. It would have had an E on the end. And it kind of means under the arch or near the arch. So he found a link back to, like a direct link back to the Norman conquest and Norman the Conqueror. So the Norman king, I'm on a direct line back to him as a descendant, which is kind of crazy. So this was the starting point. I didn't know that then, but this was the kind of the way into the project. And so I just started taking pictures with the threshers. And actually, I'll go back to this image. So then my dad told me about this place that my uncle found it online. There was like a website which was kind of wreck of the week, where people were selling like these kind of places that are kind of wrecks that people can buy to do up. And this was a place that my 7 times great grandfather William Darch had owned. So there was a mill nearby there. So it was like kind of almost in a way a bit like a detective, like following up these leads, and just like I had done, like you talked about world building with like the Moor and Vale. I started doing it in a similar way for Durlescombe, but it was just like I talked about, is these kind of images, that this very particular type of image or subject matter that fitted into my notion of what this place is. And so it's kind of something that there is like an element of nostalgia, but it's this kind of mix of like past and present. So I like that, she's wearing a Calvin Klein t-shirt. So it kind of, it does date it. It's not like I'm trying to make something that looks old or is in the past, but I'm obviously like drawing on this notion of the past, and also talking about how the nature of kind of rural life has changed, like the industrialization of processes. So they're using a machine which is over 100 years old. Here's like another archival image that I found latterly. Darch's Flour Mills and Bakery, not a direct descendant, but it would have been linked. This is a disused mill that I found. So I've been making work for like a long time, like maybe nearly coming up to a bit under 10 years. And the work on my website separated into chapters. These chapters might change. I've been sharing a lot more stuff that's not on the website. So there's a lot of work. So a big part of that is how I bring this all together, how I collate this work, and then going back and talking about this notion of how things have changed, things have become more industrial, and also about like photography. And again, this idea of like fate and kind of right time, that, I made these images and you've got all this kind of like dust and kind of like corn kernels and bits flying up in the air. Literally this would have been kind of in the spring kind of time, early spring. And the winter that year, the factory installed a big ventilation system above the machine, so you don't have any of this dust, you don't have any of this that makes the image, that throws it up into the air. So, that's how things have kind of changed and kind of and moved forward. But I kind of felt like I just kind of got in there to make those pictures. So yeah, there's a lot going on in this work. Again, like Veil, it's really layered, and I like that idea of these kind of layers. So you don't need to know about me and my family history. It's kind of that might help, but or not help. Feel free to come in. I mean, I can't see you, so
yeah, of course. I was going to ask you this is a personal project, and so it's are you looking for something here? Are you looking for yourself? Why pick something like this to not only you continue to shoot here, so this is something that is ongoing. Tell me about that. Are you trying to find something, or is
I don't know. Not in that kind of way that people go and travel to find themselves. I've got always had quite a clear sense of me and sense of self and who I am. I think it's that this place interests me, and I'm kind of drawn back to it. And it is a series that I've kind of worked on, and I've worked on it bits. And maybe the last 2 years, I've had kind of like a relatively fallow few years for me in terms of working on my projects. I've been fortunate enough to do a couple of bigger kind of artistic commissions. And then we had COVID. That was a whole big thing that came into it. But definitely this autumn, I'm back into taking pictures for this, because I'm also conscious of how am I going to bring this all together? It's already probably going to be like maybe 4 or 5 books. Maybe it could be more. Maybe I just carry it on and it all fits into this space, much in the way that quite a lot of Stephen King's books are saying Castle Rock, or there's this idea that, you can make work that fits into this place. So I wouldn't say it's like trying to find me, but it's just trying to, I don't know, it's just trying to kind of, I don't know, have a relationship with this place, area. Yeah, I don't know.
You had talked about the history of your family there, and so I was curious what that relationship, why that was so significant for you.
Because I think, again, it's like, when you're a young person, like a teenager, at the time I was just like, oh God, family history, boring. It's like gardening. You don't care about that as a teenager. I mean, maybe some teenagers do. I mean, but I didn't. I was too busy kind of having fun. But kind of latterly, as you get a bit older, I guess like life experiences I've been through, it was, I don't know, I became more interested in where am I from, kind of what are my roots, and equally on my mum's side, it's really interesting that there's a direct link on my mum's side to literally 3 miles or so from where we're living now. So that's something that can be explored latterly. And I just thrown up this image. So again, this was a photo that my dad took of me that I'd never seen before, as a toddler. And this is me stood next to the gravestone of my 3 times great grandfather. So again, things like that are really interesting. It's like my past, but I don't remember it. And do you know what I mean? It's kind of, I don't know, that notion kind of interesting as well.
So I was, you had talked about seeing that gravestone and being confronted with the name Robert Darch. How did that feel? Was that a little creepy? Was it kind of like our Exorcist moment? Oh, okay, this is.
Yeah, it was kind of more like a realization moment. It was like, well, this is it. This is the thing now. This is the missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle. I had all these ideas. I was overcomplicating it, and it's like, well, it's kind of in a way it's as simple as this, but then it's maybe not so simple. There's a layering as well of lots of different things going on within the work. I wouldn't say I was creeped out. I was kind of more interested. In a way, it's kind of hard to not sound like a bit egotistical. It's like, oh, it's my name, you know. But it's like, you know, you're kind of given this name, and like it's always been unique to me. I think that's the thing. You know, if you're like Sam Smith, then you probably might either meet another Sam Smith or a Dave Smith or whatever. You know, it maybe might not feel as unique, but there's always been a kind of uniqueness, I think, for me in terms of name. So yeah, it's kind of, as I said, it's you know, in a way, it's an extension of the notion of the moor as this kind of geographical place, and Vale's a geographical place, whereas like Durlescombe is like an actual name. So it's kind of, you know, and I kind of know its work because I know someone in Devon, like several years back, was like trying to find it on the map, you know, because it felt kind of believable in terms of existing. And then there's things like this, so like a photograph of this plaque in Winkley, and my brother's a graphic designer, so I just got him to place the Winkley with a Durlescombe in there. So there's little things that I pull in like that. So that there's within it, there's a, you know, one or two images that are, you know, slightly more kind of like constructed or staged. And so then past the Threshers, so then I started, like, I found this church, you know, I just was drawn to it because I really love the colours. But then, like, my distant relatives, they were like sort of devout Methodists, and it was a Methodist church, so there was that link there as well. And it was in the town where my 4 times great-grandfather lived. And then there were things like, you know, I kind of, again, talking about signs, I found this in like an old mill that was linked to some of my kind of familial history, and I didn't realize it at the time. This was a point where I was just kind of shooting blind in a way. I didn't really know that I was kind of retracing my kind of history's kind of footsteps in terms of places that they were. And for me personally, you know, as a young person, I was a big fan of the band Nirvana. It's how Kurt signed off his suicide note. It's better to burn out than fade away. So there was that kind of, you know, kind of related to that. And also like obviously they ran out of some paint, but did they purposely not finish the quote as a kind of a statement? There's all those questions. I mean, all, you know, it's just like when you find this kind of stuff, I find it fascinating. I don't know.
I love your portraits, by the way. Yeah, I'm really enjoying the portraits. How important are the portraits to you, and what's your approach to those?
Yeah, really, I think really important. And I will probably have a lot of landscape photographers that might want to kind of chop my legs off. But for me, like inherently, like photographing the landscape, I think is easier than portraiture, because it's just a case of framing, shooting in the right light. And I don't know, like maybe there's an arrogance there or whatever, but for me, I always found portraits to be more challenging to get a good portrait, because you got to think about the setting, but also that it's really about the relationship between you and that person. It's the psychology between the two of you that you end up with this portrait that works really well, that they feel comfortable enough with you. There's a lot of quiet moments, like I'm not talking at all when I'm taking pictures, so there's this stillness, and I kind of want that to always translate. So don't be mad at me, landscape photographers.
Well, there's a care there. You have a care there that I see, and there's, of course, the light plays a big factor into it. And I love how you this work has a blend of portraiture and landscape. Can you talk about that relationship? Why you feel that's necessary to have both? There's always a human element to, especially landscape. In some places, especially towns, you know, you can see the human influence. And so, is that kind of the line you're trying to draw? The people in their land, the land and the people, like. What are you trying to do here? What are you trying to say?
Well, I guess like England's like a small country with a lot of people, so there isn't really anywhere unless you get up into the wilds of Scotland, that's not inhabited by people. So I always feel like the people, and all this landscape is farmed landscape, so it's been changed and affected by people over generations. There's not much landscape that's kind of pristine landscape. So we've played a role in that. So for me, it's really important. I think, it's just as important as the landscape. It's kind of a marriage between the two. And actually, I think I tend to struggle thinking about just, I've worked on a few series that is just landscape, and I'm still doing that, but I tend to, there's a fight to think, oh, I should include people. But, sometimes you don't have to. It can just be landscape. But this is a working landscape. It's kind of a rural landscape. It's about, working the land in its kind of fields and, woodland and streams and farms. So I think the people are really integral to that part of the project. And I don't know, it kind of really interests me. It's, I'm not necessarily the most sociable person, but I like meeting people on my terms. So you meet people that are working in the landscape, doing a job, their characters. And then I find that really interesting, learning about their lives and their experience. If they've, I guess in my point of view, kind of lived as kind of interesting or kind of, I don't know, an interesting life really. And I kind of want that to come across in the pictures. But then also, like all of my work, people are kind of like archetypes in a way. They're like an archetype of a person. So they're them, but they're also kind of something greater, kind of like a character, I suppose. And then there were other kind of lovely coincidences. So this is John. He was there plucking the geese, and he was my connection into that. And I met him on this farm because the threshers went there, and his son-in-law owned the farm. And I got chatting to him and found out that his wife was a Darch before he married her, and she grew up on a mill. So again, just, there's not that many Darches in Devon, but there's just this lovely coincidence in a way of some kind of sort of shared history, and he'd kind of invite me along to things or get to photograph stuff. So that was, kind of really rewarding as well.
Very cool. I think this series is really interesting. Partly how you're using archive images, and you're using images that you take, and how you blend landscape with portraiture. And how long do you think this series is going to go for you?
Good question. I mean, I don't know. I think I need to, as I said, I think I need to start resolving it at some point. And the idea is that the book follow the seasons. So you maybe have spring, summer, autumn, winter. I think that's the kind of the general idea. But I think the problem is while you're still just shooting on it and making work, it's kind of, I guess it's still in progress, isn't it? So I don't feel like I kind of want to maybe resolve something until I feel like I'm done. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and this is not a pressure to resolve it either. I'm just, I'm curious, I often have this conversation with people, and it's come up many times in my interviews on this show, is this idea of the long game, and being being okay with doing something for a really long time, and taking that and not necessarily being rushed by a deadline per se, like I have to resolve this or whatever. I think there's a lot of magic that comes from that kind of approach. And you inherently, when you take a long approach to anything, there's a journey that you go on, and you change, and the place changes, and throughout that whole journey is kind of, in a photographer's case, it shows up in the photography. And so I think it's something that is something that I'm drawn to a lot. And I got really excited. It's one of the reasons I wanted to see it, is because I really like this idea of you don't necessarily have to resolve it. You can pull out images like this and do a show already, or even make a book, or make a series of books, and
yeah. And I have done. I've been, exhibiting the work. So it's not like it can be exhibited, because an exhibition anyway is always just a small example of like a wider work, and the work inherently all has the same kind of feel or atmosphere. So that's fine. I think it's just, I kind of feel it, and I've worked on other projects. So, worked on the island in the meantime, which, is just a smaller project. I kind of know it is. And so some projects are smaller, some are longer. And I think you always have that feeling. So for me, this work is maybe kind of like, sort of like the epitaph work in a way. It's kind of like, this is the work. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, I have to handle it. I have to handle it right. Do you know what I mean? In terms of when it actually is realized, and how that might look, and, and how I might do that.
You'll know. Also,
it has no timeline, no deadline. It's kind of, and going back, I might go and rephotograph with the guy I last photographed of like 6 or 7 years ago. So I like the idea that you'll see that time pass as well. And a lot of these people, will probably have sadly passed away now, because some of them were quite old when I photographed them. Yeah.
Well, I think this is a great transition to your next project. Yeah, to the island, which is the book that I have here. And I have when I was doing research on you, I was given this book, and I'm just quite taken with seeing your work in a print. And seeing it in book form, and the nature of the high contrast, the kind of black and white that you work with, is just wonderful. So if you would like, we can go ahead and transition into that work. I would love to hear a little bit of background on that project, what inspired you to do it.
Of course.
And so on, and kind of give our audience a little background of this, and then maybe you can tell us how we can get one, if this is still in print or it's still available. So, yeah.
So as the island, as I talked about, it was, the initial thing was this kind of response to the Brexit vote and the heaviness, but the genesis in a way was kind of much earlier. In terms of the atmosphere, for years I'd kind of been like sort of loosely trying to make ideas around this notion of like Sunday in this country. So I kind of grew up in the Midlands, and it's very landlocked. So often in the winter, it seemed to be the Sundays were just this grey, still, and just really kind of like no wind. And there was like a heaviness. And then I was, thought about like the Morrissey song, but every day is like Sunday. Every day is Scotland and grey. So there's obviously this notion of this being a thing. Do you know what I mean? And like, and I didn't know that song at the time. So there's that going on. Again, it's this jigsaw puzzle. There's that going on that's been bubbling for a while. Then there's the Brexit vote, and then there's thinking about the relationship between my youth and how I perceive the youth. Or how I perceive the futures of the youth to be at the moment, or the time they're living in. So we have that going on. So it's these different elements I start bringing together. But from a simplistic point of view, it's like, so I'm photographing young people, and I'm photographing in the landscape, and I'm just kind of looking for stuff. So up until this point, I'd just been working in colour, and I actually found, going back on my original stupid statement of black and white's easy, I found it really hard making a transition into shooting black and white images. Like, I always preferred them as color images, so it took some time to start seeing again in black and white. And it is a way, like in terms of workflow with a camera, I was just shooting on like raw monochrome, so like I was seeing monochrome on the camera, which really helped, but it took some time to do that. And for Durlescombe, I tried shooting in black and white, but I preferred it as colour, and I was trying to force that, and it wasn't working. Whereas this just inherently worked. There was something about it that kind of made sense, and it worked as black and white. And so I went there. So in terms of the structure of the work, it's probably the loosest in terms of narrative and in terms of place. So it's really centered on atmosphere and feeling. And so the work is predominantly, it's portraiture that I shot specifically for the project, like young people I knew that I'd either photographed with before, or I knew through other people, and like I discussed the notion of the project. And again, so they become like archetypes, like stand-ins for the people of their generation. And then I specifically went to some places to shoot the landscape. So you'd have like the person stood over the cliffs. I wanted this notion of being like an island looking out to sea. But then unusually at this point, because I have built up like an archive of images, there were images that I had in my archive that I was like, well, this would work really well in this project. So I there's instances where I pulled them in. For example, Ollie here, I think I can't remember how old he would have been in this, but he's probably kind of mid-20s now, and I kind of knew him since he was maybe like 14 years old, because he was the boyfriend of a young woman I knew at the time through her mum. So, and now he's a photographer, he's working as a photographer. So it's kind of in a way like you're kind of building these relationships. And this was an image that I'd just taken previously that I'd kind of come across in like an abandoned factory, but I felt like this will work really well in the context of this series. And that's the first time I've kind of done this in terms of pulling images into the work from the wider archive. And then again, you have like these happy accidents that I'm out photographing, and you come across a door and like 23, and I'm like 23, and then that's the date of the vote, the 23rd. So things like that, again, just kind of like happy coincidences. And Ruby was a young person that came along to like my photography collective for a while. So it tended to be young people that I knew that I would photograph with, that there was some kind of previous relationship.
Is the key significant here in that image?
Not really at all. No, she just had a key around her neck. I don't even think I asked her what it was for. I guess maybe it was just like a front door key. Some people wear a front door key around their neck, don't they? But yeah, it didn't come up. But visually it works really well in terms of like a point of interest. Sometimes things are just happy coincidences. And I did take some pictures of Ruby in a kind of really dark background, but then I ended up liking this sort of out of focus wooded background worked much better for me. And this is the image that I obviously talked a bit about earlier. So Daisy I'd photographed with previously, the early days of Durlescombe, when it was going to become something else. I'd photographed with her, and she just was kind of loosely connected to some of the young people in my collective. Kind of like a weird one, like she'd been following me on Tumblr. Remember Tumblr?
Oh yeah.
And then I put the two and two together, that she'd used some people that I knew. So and I photographed her for that. And then when this idea came up, I talked to her about it, and when she said, and she had a boyfriend at the time, well, so said, would he be good? Find like to meet up? And she's like, yeah. And so we met like on a really kind of bleak midwinter's day with one of their friends' properties. I guess it was his parents' property. They had this kind of like farm in the middle of nowhere in Devon, and he had like a big tree platform, which is also in the book. That was kind of what drew me in. And then this was just like a kind of sort of almost semi-abandoned van kind of on their land, where they were just sat, and I started taking some pictures. So again, we like spent the whole day together hanging out and chatting, and and that's how that came together. And this is Princetown Prison, which is on Dartmoor. And this would have been like an outtake from an editorial commission I had for the Telegraph magazine, which is like a newspaper in the UK. So this is another kind of sort of borrowed image, which I hadn't used for that, but worked really well in terms of the context of the island. This is over on Portland Island, which is like a small island off the county of Dorset in England, which is the county next to Devon. And I'd been here several times because the place really interested me. And there was some genesis with this place in the notion of the island. So the idea of the island I had before the Brexit vote. So I was here thinking about making some work or working on a project because it was part of England, but it felt slightly other, slightly separate. There were lots of quarries there, a couple of prisons. But this was an image that I made after the Brexit vote, and I went back to the island to specifically take pictures.
You're thinking about the Brexit vote, and for someone that is on the outside looking in, how did that? I'm sure there's different viewpoints on it. What viewpoint were you exploring here? Like, was this significant? Did it feel like you got that? What exactly were you tapping into here as far as the feeling?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a hugely complicated thing, and
Yeah.
why it happened. It's so layered, and the easiest thing in a way in a project would be to make a really condescending work about the kind of people that have this Little Britain mentality. I mean, I grew up in the Midlands, which is a very Little Britain mentality, like our country in general. Not everyone. In a way, I'm maybe I'm definitely more judgmental as a person than as a kind of image maker, as an artist. I don't want to attack people or make a kind of negative statement specifically about people. So it is political, but and in the text, there's a little bit about that. I talked about that the idea of Little Britain. But I can also understand why people voted for Brexit. This feeling of kind of lack of power, completely disenfranchised, living really tough lives, like low-paid jobs. I can completely understand how that happened, because I kind of, I'm from I guess was a relatively privileged background, like a middle-class background. Both my parents were teachers, but we weren't exactly, well off. We were okay. But, I was educated, so I had the kind of benefit of that education. But, I worked lots of kind of low-paid jobs. And really right up until now, I was in kind of 0 hours kind of jobs and kind of am still, actually, to be honest. But, they're just better paid because they're slightly more professional in terms of lecturing. But, I don't have contracts or anything. So I suppose I'm still a bit in that. But anyway, I'm digressing. But what I didn't want to do is I didn't want to make this kind of judgmental work. I kind of, this is my feelings, this is my response. I feel heavy. This feels like a complete misstep. And actually more than heavy, I was really angry. Do you know what I mean? There was a lot of anger there as well. But I channeled the energy into the heaviness rather than the kind of anger. And you can see it, like the kind of, now it's a complete disaster, and a lot of people that voted for it are like, well, I wouldn't vote for it now. Certain politicians are like, well, you did it wrong, you didn't do it right. Well, it's like, well, there's no right way to do it. You cutting yourself off from your biggest market in terms of trade, and even from my point of view, as a kind of selling books, you're posting out into Europe, and unfortunately everyone has to pay import duties now, whereas before there was just this open flow between all the countries. So, I can't imagine any kind of small to medium business in this country just can't really deal with anyone in Europe anymore. They can't do business with them. It's just crazy. It's like an absolute, like a lot of the cartoons were at the time, it's just like shooting yourself in the foot. It's like ridiculous. But yeah, that kind of like what, I didn't necessarily want to translate into it. I wanted that kind of heaviness, that kind of like, well, this is a mistake.
Well, did that lead into the name, the island? You could almost use that as a metaphor itself,
Yeah,
Some
yeah,
people say, well, you're putting yourself out on an island, you know what I mean? Separating yourself from the world, you know? Is that
yeah,
what
yeah.
inspired the title?
I think a bit. I mean, I had the notion, I had the title of the island anyway because of this place, Portland Island, but especially because England is an island, and sometimes
Hmm.
like even the politicians just lose sight of that because you get so like, this is our place, this is where we are. I think it's maybe like Dominic Raab, one of the politician here, and during the whole Brexit process, it was literally a statement from him where he'd overlooked the importance of Dover because everything that comes here has to come in through the bloody port. Do you know what I mean? Like everything has to be shipped. It's like almost just forgetting that is just insane. But it's that kind of mentality that you feel like, well, this is everything. This is
Gotcha.
all. This is all. So the island definitely makes sense. And then latterly, we had COVID. The UK was described as Plague Island in some kind of articles because at the time, Boris just wanted to let the virus run wild. Yeah. So there's, from my point of view, there's lots again going on in this work, but yeah, the predominant feeling I wanted to get across was this kind of sort of heaviness, kind of moving into something that was almost a bit kind of creepy or a bit horror, like the horror of everything, and in a weird way was a kind of, without me seeing it, like a sort of precursor to COVID, what we all kind of lived through, that sort of isolation and separation and all the lockdowns. But obviously I, couldn't have predicted that.
So talk to me a little bit about how you translated this into a book. And I've seen this work through the book. I'm sure you've done a show. Talk to me a little bit about how you see this in the world. Do you see it book, also exhibition? Let's make that connection to.
Yeah, I mean, predominantly I make work in the context of books. That's kind of what interests me the most. Again, like my kind of slightly simplistic head heart, I will use another slightly simplistic in terms of introvert, extrovert. So as an introvert, a book is great. It's like I made this thing. It's my, it's my work. You can buy it and you can look at it in your own space and your own time, and you can enjoy it if you enjoy it. If you don't like it, you don't like it. You can. It's this thing, and you can have it, but I don't need to be involved with it. Whereas an exhibition to me is very much like, this is me. This is my work on the wall. It's like a kind of peacock thing. I'll send out people invitations to come along, like a kind of big celebration, and it's like, look at me, look at me. And again, it's quite a simplistic thing, but I think for me, books work better in that context. And also that, there's quite often like a narrative to my work, like a flow to it. You can include all the images in a book. Obviously people can open the book at whatever page they want, but there is a way that the images are sequenced and ordered. Sometimes harder to do in an exhibition. So it's not that I don't like exhibitions. It's just, for me, I feel like the book is the better kind of the better, not vehicle, but yeah, the better way of showing work. And it just came together really nicely. It was the first time I worked with kind of self-published, worked with a designer, and Tom did a really great job, I think, in terms of the design and the printing, and that was really kind of helpful because it was an area where I don't feel like I'm as skilled in, so it was really good to kind of pass that off to someone else. Obviously, we had lots of discussions about the design. It was in a way he led that, but it was collaborative. It wasn't kind of like I'm doing this and that's it. So there was, I'm probably slightly annoying and maybe quite controlling in terms of that I have an idea of how something should be. There was, a lot of discussion around the front cover. He maybe originally wanted like a different image, but from my point of view, like I feel like everyone does always judge a book by its cover, and the front cover's got to be this kind of strong standout image that kind of like says what the work's about. You know, kind of like a very basic sort of advertising way. And it was an image that it didn't work for me in the context of the series, but you know, I can look back at it and it worked really well. The crop of it for the cover, and then having the wraparound. So it was, from my point of view, like a really good experience.
The book is a nice size. It's it's a very nice size, and it lends well to photography. You know, there's sometimes the size doesn't. You know, sometimes they're small, and some images are great for that. But for these images, you do such a great job of burying certain things in, and you always like to. There's this one image where you have this house, and it looks like there's a boat in the yard. There's a lot of tree limbs everywhere. For a kind of image like that, this lends itself well to the size, and I thought it was a fantastic book, and it's really, really interesting what you said there, that you think about books first, and then, you know, it's not as if you don't like an exhibition. It has its own purpose, but you're there it is again. You're telling us a story. You're taking us on a journey with your images, and it's kind of unfolding through portraiture, through landscape, and so on. And so, like, I really liked it. I really enjoyed it, and I love the background that you gave us around Brexit, and kind of that feeling. When you did this work, you know, did you find a lot of people that related to the way you felt about this? Did you find people really resonated with the work? What was the reception like to the project?
I think so, because if you think that the vote was very close, it was like 52-48, so a lot of people didn't want this to happen, and that was even before we've experienced Brexit in all its glory. I mean, I don't even really like saying the B word, the Brexit word, because it's just an annoying word. I think that's helpful, that it's such a big thing that's happened that people are going to resonate with the atmosphere and the feeling and the mood. But what I really like is when the stuff that is embedded in there from my kind of psyche, kind of going back to my past in terms of music. And there was a photographer in Germany that bought the book and read a review and kind of corresponded a little bit with me. And she said, oh, it reminds me of like when Suede was singing about the beautiful ones. And it's like, well, yeah, amazing. It's, for me, like Suede's in there, like Saturday Night and Beautiful Ones, all that kind of music from that period. Do you know what I mean? So there's something sometimes that you're translating in the work that's not necessarily spoken about, but it's kind of there. And that kind of really interests me when people pick up on something that's very specific. It's not even kind of like discussed in the work, that it resonates with them, or that it can resonate with someone that's not from the UK, or, you know, again, it's levels. You know, you can respond to it in various different ways. I think that's the kind of beauty, really, of photography, and I don't know, working on a project. And I actually, you know, I really love that when people drop me a message or say, I really love this or really like that. It's kind of like, wow, you know, in terms of my life arc from those dark days of being ill, is, you know, like the life experience now in a lot of ways just feels insanely surreal, you know, like some of the exhibitions I've been in, or some of the people that have supported me. It's just like, what, you know, how did this happen, you know? So that feels kind of crazy, really. That's sort of, you know, how that's happened, you know.
Yeah, it's a really interesting journey, and I really enjoyed you actually taking the time to take me and the audience through that. And I just have one question for you, and this is for anybody that's hung out this long with us. And,
well done.
might be an aspiring photographer themselves, you know, And I'm sure you get asked this all the time, but I'm going to place us in our time, in 2023, when we're just inundated with images and we're just surrounded by them constantly. We're being influenced by them. Do you have any advice for people to how they can find their voice and cut through the noise? And
it's probably the hardest thing. I think what I'd say is you've always got to make work that's kind of personal to you. It can be the same subject or the same place. So, things in like Vale and the island, I'm probably photographing in a very similar place to Jem Southern, who taught me, but he's working in such a different way, you wouldn't know it was the same place. So a different person will have a different approach. So I think probably the hardest thing to do is try and be like an artist photographer. When I'm teaching students, you can learn photography and you can get a job as a commercial photographer or be a wedding photographer. That's pretty realistic in a lot of ways, but it's trying to break through in terms of, and I wouldn't say I'm like an amazing example of that. I'm kind of whittling away and doing what I can do. But, it's the equivalent of like, I want to record an album, or, I kind of want to play tennis at Wimbledon. I don't know. Do you know what I mean? There's this kind of, it's an end level thing. So for me, I just make work because I love doing it. It's just what I do, what I love doing. And that's got to be the starting point for everyone. You make it for you. And then if you're fortunate enough that it resonates with someone beyond you, then that's amazing. But you have to do it for you and get the enjoyment from it. When I was younger, I used to skateboard. I knew I'd never be pro, but I enjoyed and loved skateboarding. So that's why I did it, So it's similar. Why do we do things? Because we love doing them. So that's got to be the starting point. And then you go from there, and then you just try and find your own voice. And I think in general, it's a long answer, it is harder for young people at uni as students, because they do this kind of, they do school and they do college and they go straight to uni. And maybe a lot of them just haven't had as much life experience, I would be making very different work at like 20 years old as opposed to mid-40s now, because I've had life experience, and that you can kind of, that is embodied in the work. So I don't know. There is no right. Make good work, a lot of luck, and just work hard. I've always worked really hard, practice, make lots of pictures, that's it.
Well, I really appreciate your time today, and I just want to say thank you. And I'm sure my audience is probably saying thank you as well. So thank you for your time today, really.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for listening.
Of course. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. If you like this content, please like, share, and subscribe, as well as think about supporting us. We have a Patreon so that you can support this channel and support getting more of this kind of content to you. And with that said, until next time, we'll see you on the next Urbanaut.